What I'm about to show you right now is probably one of the most game-changing mixing tips. And finally, when EQing your kicks, this is an incredibly useful tip, and that's why sound selection is so important to understand. Alright, what's good YouTube? As requested, in this tutorial I'm going to be going over how to significantly improve the mixes of all your beats. In this tutorial I'm going to cover everything you do and do not need to know when it comes to mixing. Topics such as how to properly EQ your sounds, how to perfectly level your beats, how to create headroom, how to mix your melodic as well as drum sounds perfectly, how to master your beats, as well as various tips and tricks along the way. Also, if you want any of the drum sounds or samples that I use in this tutorial, there's a link in the description where you can download them completely free. So in this tutorial, I'm going to be mixing a beat that I made 3 years ago because it's a perfect example of a good beat that was ruined by a bad mix. Also, I left an FLP with all the sounds needed in wave format in the drum kit in the description so you can follow along with the tutorial and mix it as we go. So here's the before version of my beat. I'll play you a preview of what it sounds like. So you may think to yourself that that's not that bad, but trust me, when we're done mixing it, it's going to sound 10 times better. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is link everything to the mixer. The way you do this is you drag your mouse here along the pattern block and select everything. Then you want to go into the mixer, come here and right click the first mixer bus, go to option, link selected channels, and then click starting from this track. What this will do is automatically move every single thing we selected to the mixer for you. I strongly recommend you only do this when the beat is complete because you don't want to be adding new sounds to ones which are already mixed, because it's a relative process, meaning adding just one new drum or melodic sound can force you just have to remix the entire beat all over again. And with mixing or beat making in general, you just want to be as efficient as possible. That being said, there's an exception for this when you're adding like basic EQs to cut out glaring lows and highs, or really when you're just adding any sort of effects. So this next step is optional, but it can really help you out. What you can do is go into your selected bus here and add this plugin called Wave Candy. Go in the top right corner right next to the X, right click and select the theme Alt Meter Gradient. What this will do is give you a larger, more visible volume meter tool that will allow you to get more precise levels when you're mixing. So now let's go over EQing our sounds. What I'm about to show you right now is probably one of the most game-changing mixing tips. Come over to the master right here and take the stereo separation knob and turn it all the way to the right. So now what this does is it leaves our beat in mono. Mixing in mono, specifically when EQing your sounds, is really important because you can achieve a great mixture when you mix in stereo, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to sound good in mono. But every time you achieve a good mix in mono, I promise you it'll always sound good in stereo. Ideally, you want to get to the point where your mix is so good, to the point where that you can't even tell that you're playing the beat in mono. Okay, so this is how you should EQ your melodies. Generally, you want to use some form of low pass, high pass cutting EQ like this. You can use a less harsh one like the secret EQ I talked about in the Pierre tutorial. It really depends on how much you want to cut. And what we're going to do is we're going to solo each sound by right clicking it in the mixer, and we're just going to drag these low pass and high pass knobs up and down until we get an EQ that we like. You ideally want to cut off as much as possible without changing the sound, so you really gotta listen for when you reach that point to when the sound starts to change, because that's the point when you know you're cutting out too much. You also gotta understand what each sound contributes to the beat. If we're EQing a main lead sound that plays throughout the beat, we want to leave the EQ more open. If we're EQing a background ARP or a pad sound that we want to sit in the background, we can EQ it a little bit more because it's not meant to stand out in the first place. Basically what I'm saying is the more you cut, the less that sound is going to stand out, so it really depends on what you're EQing. So I went ahead and already did that. Before the EQs, the melody sounds like this. And with the EQs, it sounds like this. Alright, so this is how you EQ your drum sounds. Everything we just talked about also applies to the drums, but there's only really 3 things that I want to mention. The first is what you want to do is go into the individual EQ that each bus has, go into the hi-hat, snare, and clap buses, and slightly increase the high end by a few dB. You'll see a lot of people just do this on their master because they're selling beats to artists and not really selling them online, so they don't really have the time to get those perfect mixes because they're not competing with other producers. But if you really want the best mix possible, don't just EQ the master, EQ these sounds individually so they stand out. The second thing I want to talk about is EQing the 808. A lot of people, because it's a bass sound, don't consider EQing out the low end, but actually doing this will make your 808 stand out so much more in the beat, because nobody even hears those frequencies below 30 Hz in the first place. And if you just EQ out the high end, it's just going to get more focused on these frequencies, and it's actually going to make the 808 sound more muddy. And finally, when EQing your kicks, this is an incredibly useful tip. Take the low end EQ from your kick, go to this band width knob, and turn it down to create this peak effect. And what this will do is focus specifically on the really harsh frequencies in the kick, which will make it hit way harder. But that's it. The drum sounds before EQing sounds like this. And with these EQs, the drums sound like this. So now let's talk about adding effects. First, let's talk about melodies. The first thing you should try is, while still in mono, mess with the panning of your sounds. Being in mono helps because it makes it easier to hear all the little stereo pockets in the beat, which are way harder to hear in stereo. Same thing goes for these stereo separation knobs. Increasing it will spread the sounds around. Decreasing it will center them more in the beat, and it's easier to hear where to get a perfect mix more in mono than it is in stereo. As for effects, the only thing I really want to go over is reverb. Like we said with the EQ, you want to give more frequencies to sounds that are more important to focus on in the beat, stuff like leads and keys. So as for sounds that we want to have sit in the background, stuff like pads and arps, adding a reverb can really help, as it not only gives it more stereo, but it'll actually make your sounds more muddy so they're less focused on in the beat. So what I did was I add this cathedral reverb to the choir pads that sit in the background, as well as a similar reverb to a lead pad that comes in during the chorus. Before, they sounded like this. And with the reverb, they sound like this. I'm not using that many effects, but really just use them to your liking. It really depends. So now let's talk about adding effects to your drums. So for hi-hats, you usually will want to keep a slight reverb on them. I just use this default reverb, and you want to turn it down to a really low level. I have it at about 10%. This will, like with the pads, make the hi-hat sit more in the background and not stand out too much, as it's a really sharp sound and we don't want that. For the snare, what you want to do is just add like the slightest delay to it. I find it not only helps with blending the snare in with the beat, but it also gives it a little more bounce as well. These are the settings I use. You can just copy them here. So with the delay, the snare sounds like this. Then I add this reverb to the clap just to make it more spacious, less sharp, and just have it blend in with the beat altogether. It sounds like this. Then I add a bunch of reverb to a crash sound that plays in each bar, because I really want to ensure that's just sitting in the background and not distracting from the beat. That sounds like this. Okay, last but certainly not least, this is how I mixed the 808. First thing I did was add this limiter. When you have a lot of 808s playing in the beat, you'll have these points where the frequencies will shortly peak at high volumes and cause clicking and distortion. So we want to get rid of them by clipping them out. Just copy these limiter settings. The only knob you need to know is this limiting ceiling knob down here. And you just want to move it down till it's sitting right on top of the peak for each 808 and getting rid of the little clicks that happen throughout. Then I add this override distortion. This will really help with making the 808 stand out more, which is what we want, as the 808 is the heart of the beat. Then I add this plugin called Sausage Fattener. It really just makes the sound louder. You can just use the amp knob in the pre-computed effects section. Then I just add these two EQs to make certain frequencies and notes stand out that weren't hitting the same. So before the effects, the 808 sounds like this. And with effects, it sounds like this. But that's it for drum effects. Now let's go over the most important step in mixing, and that's leveling. We're doing this last because adding EQs and effects will alter the levels of your sounds, and doing this after would be pointless because you're just going to have to level them all over again. So first, you want to start by turning all your sounds down. So now what we're going to do is slowly increase the volumes of each sound individually to the ideal levels we'd like, starting with whatever sound plays throughout the entire beat. Usually, but not always, that'll just be a lead sound. So if you have fewer sounds, you can increase the volume volumes of each a little bit more, but if you have a lot of sounds, in the case of this beat, you want to level them to a lower volume. Now with that leveled, one at a time, you want to increase each melodic sound to an ideal level relative to the volume of your lead sound. I went ahead and did this already. Before doing this, our levels sounded like this. And after leveling, it sounds like this. Okay, so now let's go over leveling your drum sounds. As you'll see, this process is way different. This is also the main reason we add this Wave Candy dB meter, because there are very specific levels that we want to stick to for each of our drum sounds. So these are the ideal levels that you want all your drum sounds to sit at. For kicks, when you have one, this will almost always be the loudest thing in your beats. You want to level this till it sits somewhere between the -7 and -5 dB ranges. The next loudest element is the clap. Ideally, you want this to sit at somewhere in the ranges of -10 and -8 dB. Then the next loudest element is the 808. Usually you want it to sit in the ranges of around -12 to -9 dB. Note that if you don't have a kick and you're only using an 808, specifically like a stubby 808 like the Zay 808, you want to level it to the dB ranges of a kick because it serves the same purpose in the beat in terms of what it adds to the rhythm. So the next loudest sound is the snare. You want that to sit in the ranges of -13 to -10 dB. And like with the kick and 808, the same thing applies to the snare and clap, that if you're using just a snare or just a clap in your beat, you want to increase the levels significantly more to compensate. Then the next loudest sound is perks, if you have any. In this beat we don't, but if you do, you want that to sit in the ranges of around -19 to -13 dB. The next loudest sound is the hi-hats. You generally want this to sit in the ranges of -20 to -16 dB. Then finally you have the open hats, which you want to sit in the dB ranges of -25 to -20. If you're using effects, you usually want these to sit slightly below the open hats, but it really depends on what type of effects you're talking about. Okay, so before leveling our drum sounds, they sounded like this. And after leveling them, they sound like this. So you may think everything together sounds really quiet, because it should, because we have one more step in the process. What you want to do now is go into your master and then go into Fruity Multiband Compressor, right click these arrows in the top right corner and select the mastering 2.4 dB preset. Now we just want to mess with this master volume knob in the bottom left to the levels of our liking. And that's it for mixing. Before all of this, our original beat sounded like this. And with everything mixed, the final beat sounds like this. So leveling is all about getting the relative levels right. It's not necessarily just about getting your sounds loud and giving them enough space, but it's really about getting the volume ratios between each sound perfect. So not how loud is the kick, but really how loud is the kick relative to the snare? How loud is the snare to the hi-hats? How loud is the hi-hats to the claps, and so on. So that being said, don't feel like you need to memorize these exact dB numbers. You can for reference, but I'd say it's way more important to memorize how loud each sound is relative to one another. When I make beats, my levels are never the same because I'm using different sounds all the time. I don't have the time to get each level perfect, and neither will you. That being said, the relative volumes that I use for all my melodies and all my drum sounds though do stay consistent with what I did in this tutorial. So overall, this may not seem like a lot, but trust me, if you keep practicing this way, not only will you train your ear to know what a proper mix sounds like, but you'll eventually be doing this whole process in just the span of a few minutes. Also note that you don't need to mix your beats exactly the way I did in this tutorial every time, as every mix will be different. And I promise that if you just apply a little bit of the stuff that I talked about in this tutorial, you'll notice significant improvements in all of your mixes. If you don't, then your issue is most likely not with mixing, but rather sound selection. And that's why sound selection is so important to understand, because the majority of producers out there can't tell the difference between when their mix is bad and when their sound selection is bad. So a lot of the times they'll just sit there trying to mix a beat or a sound that will, no matter what they do, never sound good. So with that in mind, if you plan to apply all the stuff we talked about in a separate beat and your mixes are still really bad, then I promise you, then it's an issue with sound selection. I can sit here for another 10 minutes and just talk about sound selection, so let me know if that's a video you'd like to see. Also, speaking of good sound selection, I'm going to be releasing my first personal drum kit sometime in the next week when we hit 1,000 subscribers, so look out for that. But yeah, that's it for this video. Let me know in the comments which tutorials you'd like to see or other producers you want me to cover. Either drill or dark Metro beats is next. Make sure to follow my Instagram at FinnaFinesse. I'm going to be giving away my drum kit early on there when I hit something like, let's say, 150 followers, so stay tuned for that. Make sure to like, subscribe, and peace.
Psych!